Ned Stark had never been a man to linger on distant legends or half-forgotten tales. His sense of duty demanded a focus on the tangible struggles that lay before him: harsh winters, the loyalty of bannermen, the tenuous peace that kept the Seven Kingdoms from devouring itself. Yet when the Raven arrived at Winterfell bearing a delicate scroll sealed with a sigil unfamiliar to most of Westeros, he couldn't shake the unease that flickered in his heart. The letter spoke of an ancient line long removed from the storied days of old Valyria, a family whose blood carried faint echoes of dragons. As improbable as such claims might have sounded to the grounded mind of the Warden of the North, the words reached beyond reason and touched something in Ned that was not purely about politics. It was, for lack of a better term, hope. A sense that, perhaps, forging a bond with a lineage so steeped in the hush of legend might offer his house a future more stable and more formidable than any he could carve by alliances alone. He took the matter up with Catelyn in the Solar. She remained calm, perched on a modest wooden seat by the fire, her hands folded in her lap. The flickering glow highlighted the concern in her blue eyes. Cat had always been practical, yet her Tully upbringing allowed for a certain acceptance of beauty and wonder, even if laced with danger. She listened as Ned explained the rumor of a lost Valyrian branch that had somehow survived the doom centuries ago, drifting westward until it found refuge across the narrow sea. Their once proud name had decayed into half-remembrance, overshadowed by the Targaryens who'd first arrived on Dragonstone. But these new scions, it was said, bore not only the distinctive silver-gold hair of old Valyria but also the pale violet eyes. They were rumored to keep heirlooms whispered to be older even than the Targaryen conquest, curiosities from a world that had been consumed by volcanic fire. Winterfell felt colder than usual that day, as if the godswood itself were holding its breath at Ned's words. The possibility of forging a new alliance for House Stark by binding Robb to such a lineage was not to be dismissed. Should the rumor hold truth, the match could fortify the Starks in ways unimaginable to the rest of the realm. Perhaps such a bride might not come with the typical sprawling alliances offered by the likes of the Freys or other major houses, but there was a distinct advantage in tying the North to a heritage both mysterious and fearsome. For if the Targaryen name alone once held the power to unite or conquer the entire continent, what small portion of that power might still rest in a family that had never bent the knee to any mortal king or queen? Though Ned's heart warred with his head, he proceeded cautiously. Ravens traveled back and forth over the course of many moons, carrying letters that tested the honesty of this rumored family. The name the letters bore was Cordine of Orion, a name that prompted as many questions as it did raised eyebrows among maesters who recognized faint echoes of Valyrian naming conventions. While Catelyn watched from a respectful distance, Ned penned letter after letter, verifying every detail that could be proven. He was a man who believed in the old ways and the old gods, but in matters as crucial as the future of his son, he needed more than rumor. Slowly, piece by piece, a picture formed of a young woman named Vina Cordine, the only daughter of her house's aged lord, said to be well-educated, discreet, and raised in the free cities under a tutelage that mixed both Essosi and Westerosi customs. Her father's letters hinted that she bore the manners and grace expected of a high-born lady, that she had a mind for courtesy and a will tempered by unusual knowledge. Rumor also whispered that she could speak the old Valyrian tongue, as if she were reciting from the songs of the Dragon Lords themselves. Though he hesitated at first, Ned found no deception in those letters. Or at least, if there was a deception, it was skillfully woven in ways his honorable mind could not uncover. And so, with the quiet blessing of his wife and the uneasy acceptance of Maester Luwin, he wrote back to Lord Cordine, proposing a formal betrothal. In truth, Ned imagined that Lord Cordine would ask for time or details, or perhaps a further exchange of signs and tokens. Instead, the old man agreed swiftly. He confided that the years pressed upon him, that his line had few branches, and that forging a bond with House Stark, honorable and noble in the eyes of the realm, would be no less than a miracle for his daughter. Robb was just shy of 16 when Ned sat him down in the same solar where he and Catelyn had first discussed the betrothal. It was a conversation that weighed heavily on both father and son. Robb had grown in leaps over the past year, his shoulders broadening with training, his hair the rich auburn brown of his Tully heritage, his eyes shaped with something of Ned's quiet sorrow. He was a boy soon to be a man, discovering his own sense of honor and principle, testing the edges of his own leadership among the wards and pages who looked to him with awe. Yet though he carried that mantle with grace, the notion of marriage, especially to a woman rumored to carry the blood of dragon lords, left him speechless. Ned watched the flicker of apprehension pass across Robb's face before his son composed himself. "You say she is not well known in Westeros," Robb said. "What if half the talk is but invention? Maybe she's no more than an associate maiden looking to marry above her station." Ned admitted that possibility, for how could he not? But he also spoke of the Stark's honor, of the chance that this could grant them a boon that no Frey, no Bolton, no Southern Lord might match. Duty, Ned reminded him gently, often arrived under many guises. Marrying for love was a rare blessing. In their world, alliances stood as the bedrock of survival. "You will grow to know her," Ned said softly, "and I pray you find your own love in time. But for now, it falls to me to ensure the foundation upon which your future stands is strong. If these rumors of her ancestry hold any truth, then the North will gain a link that no man can ignore." Robb listened. The next day, he returned to ask his father questions about Valyria, how it fell, what the Targaryens had done, whether this family's claim of an unbroken line might be met with suspicion. Each query was asked with a trace of anxiety behind it. The boy was no fool. He knew many lords might laugh at such a match, or else cast suspicious eyes upon it, especially if it reminded them too much of the Targaryens' once absolute power. Yet for every misgiving, Ned answered with the calm reassurance that the Starks had weathered centuries of war, famine, and upheaval. If the old gods willed this union, then let it be so. It was not long after the betrothal was sealed by ravens that Valyna Cordine arrived in White Harbor on a modest ship bearing a sigil Ned had never seen before, a silver four-pointed shape that might have been intended to evoke a stylized star, or perhaps a glimmer of the old dragon breath that once radiated in the forges of Valyria. The Cordine retinue was small. No more than 24 men disembarked, their attire practical and with a faint associate style. Cloaks dyed in deep shades of gray and burgundy, the fabric heavier than one might have expected from a warmer climate, as though they had some knowledge of the North's chill. But all curiosity fell upon the young lady in their midst. Under the watchful eye of Lady Catelyn and the courtiers of White Harbor, Valyna descended the gangplank with surprising self-possession. She had the unmistakable silver hair that one might associate with the Targaryens, yet the strands bore a faint glimmer of gold when caught by the sun. They were woven into a single thick braid that fell below her waist, and though the North's cold breeze tugged at the ends, she seemed unbothered by the abrupt shift in weather. Her eyes, as rumored, showed a pale violet hue, but not the harsh, almost inhuman lilac of some Targaryen lines. Instead, her gaze seemed calm, reflective, holding more warmth than ice, more curiosity than disdain. Her frame was slender, though her posture was proud. She wore a traveling cloak of darkest wool embroidered with a swirling pattern that reminded onlookers of tendrils of smoke, or perhaps the shapes of dragons in flight, though not a single dragon had been stitched in an obvious manner. Her features were mild, though they could harden into regal lines if she were so inclined. It was not Targaryen arrogance or pure associate exoticism that shaped her presence, but a quiet sense of purpose. She might have been overwhelmed, but if so, she hid it well. Catelyn, representing the Starks at White Harbor, offered greetings and hospitality. Valyna curtsied with a grace that matched any Westerosi lady, and her voice, though carrying a hint of an associate accent, was clear and respectful. The two women spoke, exchanging courtesies while the retinue made preparations for the overland journey to Winterfell. The men who traveled with Valyna were guarded, but they treated Lady Catelyn with courtesy. Their weapons were stowed carefully away, their heads bowed in deference to the lady of a great house. Nothing about them hinted at illusions of conquest or subterfuge. If anything, they seemed earnest to show that their house was worthy of the honor of joining with the North. The ride to Winterfell took several days, and Catelyn found herself quietly studying Valyna as they traveled together. The young woman rode astride a calm mare provided by House Manderley, and though she wore gloves, Catelyn could see that her grip was practiced. She handled the beast with competence. When they made camp in the evenings, Valyna would sit by the fire, politely conversing in the common tongue but occasionally lapsing into Valyrian phrases when she spoke to her retinue. Catelyn, who had never heard the old language spoken so casually, was taken aback. It was a lilting, fluid sound, reminiscent of half-forgotten songs that might have echoed in halls long turned to dust. The men with Valyna answered in measured tones, often glancing around as though wary of who might overhear, and Catelyn, ever discerning, caught the sense that Valyna's station among them was not just that of a highborn lady. She inspired a kind of reverence, as if her very blood demanded their respect. Through these quiet observations, Catelyn felt a growing respect for the girl. Valyna did not flaunt her rumored heritage, nor did she speak of dragons with the haunting obsession that some Targaryen loyalists once had. She was measured, soft-spoken, and polite, yet there was a flicker of passion in her eyes when the conversation touched on ancient lore, particularly the mysteries of the Valyrian freehold. She never once insulted the North or looked down on it as some southern courtiers might. Rather, she showed awe at the vastness of the land and seemed deeply curious about local customs, especially anything to do with the old gods. When at last they reached Winterfell, the great courtyard was awash in a swirl of activity. Robb stood beside Ned, trying not to fidget, and though he maintained a composed exterior, his chest felt tight at the sight of the silver-haired young woman dismounting before him. He had never seen eyes like hers, and the knowledge that she might become his wife put a tremor in his stomach. She curtsied low, and Robb inclined his head. The moment their gazes locked, something in him quieted. She looked neither timid nor bold, but as though the world around her was something she intended to understand before she made any moves of her own. He wondered if she was judging him, if she found his broad northern accent and massive cloak that billowed in the wind to be rustic. But if she did, she gave no sign. Ned stepped forward, offering his hand in greeting. Valyna accepted it with a gentle bow of her head, and though he was not a man quick to show warmth, Ned's voice was genuinely kind as he welcomed her to Winterfell. The retinue behind Valyna mirrored the gesture, though they remained poised, perhaps unsure of what to expect in a land so distant from their home. The brief ceremony concluded as Winterfell's servants began to unload her belongings and show her party to the guest quarters. It would be later that night, in the Great Hall, that the true introduction between Robb and Valyna would unfold under the watchful eyes of the entire castle. A feast had been prepared, modest by southern standards but hearty, with roast meats and strong ale. The tables were adorned with simple branches from the wolfswood, a tradition Cat had insisted upon for the sake of welcoming new allies. Torches flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows across the faces of onlookers. Ned sat at the high table with Valyna at his right hand and Robb beside her. Sansa and Arya peeked with a mixture of curiosity and shyness. Bran stared wide-eyed at this silver-haired maiden who spoke in a slight accent. Rickon, too young to hide his feelings, simply gazed at her with the open interest a child shows anything unusual. Valyna did her best to engage everyone in polite conversation. She complimented Winterfell's architecture, remarking on the unique warmth that rose from the hot springs. She asked after the training of the direwolves that she had heard whispered about. Now and then, the flicker of a candle caught the color of her hair, causing it to glow with an otherworldly sheen. Robb answered her politely. Shyness had never plagued him before, but he found that words came slower than usual in her presence. He felt a curious weight of responsibility. As the feast progressed, they stole glances at each other, each searching for more insight than polite words could convey. When the evening ended, and the guests were ushered to their chambers, Valyna expressed her thanks in a voice so melodic that Ned found himself recalling old songs from his youth. He escorted her to the hall that led to her chamber, parted ways with a final courteous bow, and found that his mind was unsettled with questions. What precisely lay behind that courteous exterior? Was she truly of a Valyrian bloodline that might unlock new alliances? Or did that rumor cling to her as a tool, something contrived? He told himself that only time would reveal the truth. Honor demanded that he show trust until given cause for doubt. The following days at Winterfell passed in a quiet dance of formalities. Valyna was shown the gods' wood, and it was there beneath the red leaves of the heart tree that she first gazed into the face carved by the first men ages ago. She knelt at the pool's edge, saying nothing, merely observing the old god's presence as if in silent communion with something beyond her. Sansa, enthralled by the grace of this potential sister-in-law, took the opportunity to question her about fashions in Essos, about the dances and the songs. Arya hung back, uncertain what to make of someone who seemed so different yet spoke with a gentle tone. And whenever Valyna answered, she did so without condescension. She told them bits of her life in the free cities, of Bravos, where masked courtesans paraded along the canals, and of Pentos, where the markets brimmed with spices from faraway lands. She also spoke of the lost ruins in Valyria itself, how sailors rarely returned from that doomed land, and how monstrous creatures allegedly lurked there. Robb found reasons to cross paths with her, whether it was overseeing the men-at-arms training in the courtyard or simply wandering the corridor outside the Maester's tower. Their first private conversation happened by chance. He was carrying a set of scrolls for Maester Luwin when he found her admiring an ancient tapestry of House Stark's lineage. She turned as he approached, and a shy half-smile touched her lips. His voice stumbled. They spoke about the North's old kings, and Robb surprised himself by mentioning the crypts beneath Winterfell, how each statue sat with a dire wolf at its feet. Valyna seemed genuinely intrigued, and a flicker of fascination lit her eyes, as if the very notion of ancient tombs and statues appealed to that part of her that reached out for lost history. In turn, she told him a small story from her father's collection of Valyrian lore, how the Dragonlords believed that their essence lived on in the flames of their forges, how the forging of Valyrian steel was a ritual that demanded blood, magic, and the raw heat of the 14 flames. She blushed after sharing, aware that in Westeros such talk might sound like madness. But Robb only listened, rapt, for though he couldn't fully believe or disbelieve, it stirred in him a sense of wonder that was seldom found in the practical North. By the time 2 weeks had passed, a rhythm developed. Robb escorted Valyna around the courtyards, introducing her to loyal bannermen or to the stable hands who looked after the warhorses. She spoke with them in her warm, accented voice, occasionally slipping into Valyrian phrases that made some draw back, uncertain whether it was some witch's language or simply a foreigner's tongue. Yet little by little, she impressed upon them that she was not a woman to be feared but perhaps respected. Her retinue continued to keep to themselves, practicing their own private rituals, from time to time burning incense in braziers near their quarters. That drew some suspicion. Incense was not common in the North. Yet no trouble arose from it, and so Ned allowed it to continue. The days grew colder, the winds heralding the approach of another northern winter. Word came from King's Landing that tensions ran high in the capital. Whispers of plots and counterplots circulated, though they remained no more than rumors in the quiet halls of Winterfell. Still, Ned brooded over them, recalling too well how easily a single piece of courtly intrigue could upend the entire realm. He had no illusions that their betrothal with the courtians would remain unremarked upon, either. If the crown took offense at the prospect of a Stark forging ties with a rumored line of Dragonlords, who could guess what might happen? But Ned's moral compass, shaped by the old gods and his own unwavering sense of duty, told him that strengthening the North came before appeasing southern vanity. He had lost too many friends and allies to the vices of King's Landing. Better to remain distant, forging his own path for House Stark. And so the betrothal drew closer. Plans for a wedding began to form, though in a more subdued manner than the grand feasts of southern houses. Valyna seemed content with simpler traditions, even expressing admiration for the old god's ways. When she asked if they might incorporate some subtle nod to her Valyrian heritage, a small incense offering, perhaps a line of old Valyrian spoken during the rites, Ned and Catelyn exchanged glances. Such a request could raise eyebrows among conservative northern lords. But it was a minor concession, one that might help weave trust between the two families. They tentatively agreed, with the understanding that it be handled with the dignity and restraint expected of a house as proud as the Starks. Robb found himself tangled in a mixture of emotions. The more he conversed with Valyna, the more he felt her sincerity. She never acted as if she wanted to dominate or overshadow him. Indeed, she often listened more than she spoke, gleaning from him stories of the North's bitter winters, its stirring hero tales, and the savage pride the people had in their heritage. He teased her once, asking if she expected to see actual dragons in the crypts below Winterfell. Her cheeks flushed pink, and she laughed, a free sound he hadn't heard from her before. It seemed at once like the crackle of a campfire on a cold night, something warm and comforting, with a surprising spark. Soon, they were stealing moments that were less about formality and more about genuine curiosity. On a chilly afternoon, they walked along the battlements, their breath steaming in the air. Robb shyly offered her a cloak lined with fur, one that had been in his family for generations. Valyna accepted it, running her fingertips over the soft pelt as she turned her face into the biting wind. The two of them talked about the significance of tradition, about how the old gods might or might not intercede in the fates of mortals. Valyna admitted that her ancestors once believed that the essence of the dragon was in their blood, that it guided them. She confessed she wasn't entirely certain she believed it. She had seen no living dragons. All she had were stories passed down through the generations, stories that might have changed through retelling. "You must think it strange," she said softly, facing out over the snowy expanse of Winterfell's grounds, "to bind yourself to a legacy that might be more rumor than truth." Robb paused, considering her words. "Stranger things have happened in our world," he replied. "My father always taught me to judge a person by their actions, not simply by their name. If your house claims ties to old Valyria, well, that might be. But it's the person you are that concerns me more. And so far, I've only seen that you wish to learn, to adapt." She offered him a small smile. "I do. There is something comforting in the stoic nature of the North. It's as though your people face the worst of the world's cold with a stubborn pride that can't be extinguished. Perhaps it reminds me of the old tales of Valyrian steel, unbreakable in the face of adversity." Robb felt warmth bloom in his chest at her words. They lingered on the battlements for a while, lost in a contemplative silence. Below, the yard bustled with men at arms and stable boys, the normal life of the castle continuing, unaware of the quiet shift in the relationship above. As the sun sank behind the walls, the sky turned a pale gold, and in that fading light, Valyna's hair took on the hue of molten silver. Robb caught himself staring, wondering at how someone could be so real and yet carry a hint of the fantastical in her bearing. When they parted, he found himself wishing he had more time, more words to say, or simply more quiet moments of her presence. That night, Ned called Robb to his solar once again. Over a simple meal, father and son spoke in subdued tones. Ned asked how Robb found Valyna, whether he believed she might stand by him through the myriad challenges ahead. War might come, Ned reminded his son, for King Robert's health was said to be faltering, and the Lannisters were rumored to be tightening their hold on the capital. The North might need strong alliances, or might be forced to stand alone. Would Valyna's uncertain lineage be a boon or a hindrance? Robb, with earnest honesty, said he believed that she would be a good partner, a woman of learning, of calm conviction, someone who could become beloved by the Northern lords once they saw her loyalty. He admitted he knew little of her father beyond the letters, but from what Valyna had said, Lord Cordine wished for peace and stability, just as the Starks did. Ned listened to Robb's every word, assessing the sincerity in his gaze. In the end, the only advice Ned gave was that marriage was more than a bond between two individuals. It was a bond between houses, between families, and sometimes between entire realms. Robb must be prepared to shoulder that duty, to protect Valyna as he would protect his own siblings. Robb nodded gravely, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. Yet there was also a small flicker of excitement that he could not deny. It felt like the stirring of something new, a future he had never imagined. As winter's chill deepened, the plans for the wedding began to solidify. The date would be set within a month, allowing enough time for the major bannermen to gather, to witness their liege lord's heir take his bride. Though it was not expected to be as elaborate as a royal wedding, the lords of the north would come in droves, eager to see for themselves this mysterious Valyrian lady who claimed ancient blood older than the Targaryens. Whispers circulated among the small folk as well, and some superstition began to attach itself to Valina's presence. She was not unkind to them. In fact, she went out of her way to demonstrate courtesy and generosity. But rumor had its own life, and soon enough, it was said that her eyes glowed like amethysts in the firelight, that she carried fragments of dragon eggs among her possessions, that she once burned a man to death with a mere glance. Ridiculous stories, perhaps, but they reflected the mixture of awe and fear that accompanied anything smacking of Valyria. Catelyn took Valina under her wing, instructing her on the customs of a northern wedding, how the exchange of cloaks would formalize her acceptance into House Stark. Valina listened with solemn attention. The notion of the old god's silent presence, the importance of cloaks, and the heartfelt vow that would be said before the heart tree moved her. She had seen the overwrought pomp of Associ weddings and even glimpsed the Southern Seven ceremonies, which were elaborate in a different way. But there was a haunting simplicity in the northern tradition that appealed to her. She confided to Catelyn that, at times, the hush of the gods would felt more real to her than all the gilded idols in the free cities. Catelyn smiled, pleased that the young woman approached the north with such open respect. Word arrived from across the north that lords great and small were converging on Winterfell for the wedding. From the Dreadfort to Deepwood Motte, from Bear Island to Last Hearth, banners were raised, and caravans began to move along the snow-laden roads. Some of these lords arrived with curiosity, others with the cynicism that came from living in a harsh land where legends had little place. But all recognized that an alliance forged by Lord Eddard Stark was not to be trifled with. Over time, as they arrived and were welcomed into the castle's halls, they got their first glimpses of Valina, this slender, silver-haired presence at Robb's side, and each had their own reaction. Some saw her and recalled the Targaryen war of years past, though her banner was not the three-headed dragon. Others saw only a foreigner, untested in the ways of the north. But a few, particularly those with a bent toward old tales, wondered if indeed the blood of Valyria ran in her veins and whether that might mean some new power could awaken in Winterfell's stone. In the midst of these arrivals, petty intrigue and alliances began to swirl. The Umbers, tall and brash, spoke openly about how a foreign bride might bring new flavors to the north. The Mormonts, fierce in their independence, noted that if Ned Stark had arranged the match, it must have deeper purpose. The Karstarks, stoic and calm, wondered if this bride might remind the crown of the Targaryens they had once fought. Whispers soared like ravens among the courtiers, weaving countless theories. Valina, for her part, moved quietly through the chaos. She greeted bannermen as they were introduced, treated them with measured politeness, and let them see that she was no meek ornament, but neither was she a conqueror. Day by day, a handful of them began to warm to her, finding her knowledge of local histories surprisingly deep. She had studied, it seemed, not just the Valyrian freehold but also the Seven Kingdoms and their labyrinthine histories. For some, that was a mark of respect. For others, it was cause for wariness. Amid the swirl, Robb and Valina grew closer. No grand declarations of love were made, for they both understood that what they faced was a marriage of duty. But genuine fondness blossomed. They shared jokes about the quirks of various northern lords, wandered the courtyard when they could find a moment alone, and occasionally spent hours in the library comparing old texts. Robb even tried to pronounce a few Valyrian words, only to have Valina correct him gently, her voice brimming with laughter. In those moments, their worries about what the future held eased, replaced by the fleeting comfort of youthful companionship. On the eve of the wedding, a light snow began to fall over Winterfell. The courtyard turned quieter as guests and hosts alike sought the warmth of the great hall. Robb stood in a secluded corner of the yard, watching the flakes descend, feeling that odd hush that came just before a storm. He sensed that everything was about to change forever, that once he spoke his vows, he would be bound not just to a woman but to a heritage that might alter the path of the north. Behind him, the castle loomed with torches flickering from every tower window, as if Winterfell itself stood guard over his fate. He heard a soft step behind him and turned to see Valyna. She had donned a heavier cloak, the fur collar raised, but he could see her hair slipping free at the edges. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, or perhaps from anticipation. She said nothing at first, simply standing beside him, gazing up at the sky. Snow drifted onto her braids, and she reached out her hand to catch a flake, turning it over as it melted on her palm. He found himself envying that snowflake for a fleeting moment, that it could land so gently on her hand. The thought made him blush. "Are you ready?" she asked at last, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, though he knew such readiness was more about acceptance than certainty. "I think so. My father says half of marriage is about taking on responsibilities that you may not feel ready for, but rising to meet them anyway." She smiled wistfully. "My father used to say that if the blood of the dragon truly runs in us, then we must be prepared to channel its fire, not for war or conquest, but to forge alliances that can withstand any cold. He believes that this union is our chance to restore our family's legacy in a new land." She paused, her expression suddenly vulnerable. "I only know that I want to do my duty, whether that means being a partner to you, a lady of the North, or something else entirely. I will strive to do it as best I can." Robb found himself moved by her sincerity. He gently took her hand, mindful of the ceremony they would undertake the next day, aware of the watchers behind windows, and yet wanting to reassure her as a friend. "We'll face whatever comes together," he said. "House Cordine and House Stark. Whether the realm laughs at us or fears us, whether war or peace awaits, we'll do it all side by side." She responded with a quiet squeeze of his hand, her violet eyes reflecting the torchlight. In the hushed courtyard, with snow falling around them, the gravity of their union felt both immense and strangely comforting. They stood like that for a moment longer before separating, each returning to their chambers, carrying the weight of the morrow with them. Dawn broke over Winterfell, muted behind winter clouds. The crisp air stung the lungs of every soul who stepped into the courtyard. The entire castle was alive with activity, from the kitchens to the stables, as lords and ladies prepared to witness the ceremony. The path to the Godswood was swept clear of snow, and torches lined the route, a glow that contrasted with the drab-gray sky. Within the Godswood, the heart tree stood as it had for centuries, its face silent, its red eyes imparting a timeless witness to the vows about to be spoken. Robb stood at the edge of the Godswood, accompanied by Ned and a handful of his closest bannermen, including the great Jon Umber and Lord Roose Bolton. The presence of each lord was a statement of allegiance, of a willingness to respect Ned's decision. Catelyn guided Valyna through another entrance, her arm lightly linked with the bride's. Valyna wore a gown of deep gray that shimmered faintly with metallic threads, a subtle nod to both the North Starkness and her rumored Valyrian heritage. Her hair was mostly unbound, except for a single braid that hung down her back, a tradition from her family's side, symbolizing the continuity of their lineage. From that braid hung a small silver ornament that bore a vague resemblance to a dragon's scale. Many lords looked upon this with curiosity, but no one spoke. As Valyna approached Robb, Ned stepped forward, holding the ceremonial cloak that bore the direwolf sigil of House Stark. The old gods witnessed in silence. The hush was broken only by the soft rustle of cloaks, the quiet breath of so many onlookers. Maester Luwin was present, as was the Septon from White Harbor, although the wedding would be sealed under the watchful gaze of the Godswood. Ned spoke in a calm tone, reciting the old vow that a father would say when he presented the cloak to his son's bride. Then Robb took the cloak gently from Ned's arms, stepping forward to drape it across Valyna's shoulders. She accepted it, her violet gaze steady on his. There was no fear there, only a solemn acceptance that mirrored his own. Valyna placed her hands in Robb's, her skin cool but not trembling. They exchanged the traditional words of the North, a short vow that pledged duty, honor, and protection. When it came time for Valyna to speak a small line in Old Valyrian, she did so quietly but with unwavering clarity. The unfamiliar words spilled into the frosty air, sending a ripple of intrigue through the gathered lords. Then, as was customary, Robb concluded the vow by promising to shield her from winter's chill, to stand with her against all storms. The old gods stood silent in their acceptance, and as the moment lingered, a crow cawed in the branches overhead, causing a few onlookers to glance upward. It was done. Robb pressed a respectful kiss to Valyna's brow, sealing the union. The watchers exhaled, some in relief, others in cautious optimism. The pair turned to face the gathering, a new chapter written in the annals of House Stark. The hush gave way to polite applause and murmurs of congratulations. Ned and Catelyn both stepped forward to embrace them, their expressions proud yet shaded with the knowledge that the future was uncertain. One by one, the lords came forward, offering their well wishes. Woman, joined by duty but finding an unexpected spark of tenderness. Their first kiss was soft, unhurried, carrying the promise of what might come. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but within those walls, warmth enveloped them. Morning arrived gently, diffused through a veil of gray clouds. Robb stirred, feeling the warmth of Valyna beside him. The events of the previous day swirled in his memory. The vows before the heart tree, the feast, the necklace gleaming around her neck. He turned, seeing the soft rise and fall of her breath as she slept. A flicker of protectiveness stirred in him, mingled with an emotion he could only describe as dawning affection. Carefully, he eased from the bed, not wanting to wake her, and dressed quietly. When he cracked open the door, he found a single guard outside, who nodded respectfully. Robb returned the gesture and made his way to the courtyard. Winterfell stood in the aftermath of celebration, with servants already working to tidy up the remnants of the previous night's feast. Robb breathed in the cold air, clearing his mind. He felt changed. In the eyes of the realm, he was now a husband, one who had pledged himself to a woman whose lineage supposedly reached back to the heart of Valyria. He couldn't deny the sense of both pride and foreboding that settled in his chest. Where would this path lead them? Ned found him soon enough, standing near one of the training yards. Robb greeted his father with quiet deference, waiting for the older man to speak first. Ned simply clasped his shoulder and offered a small smile. It was not in Ned's nature to ask intrusive questions, nor was it in Robb's nature to offer details of his wedding night. Instead, they shared a moment of father and son understanding, a passing of the torch from one generation to the next. Ned asked if Valyna was well, and Robb replied that she was resting, which made Ned nod approvingly. Then they spoke no more of it. Some matters were private. Over the next few days, the lords began to depart, returning to their keeps and holdings, satisfied that they had witnessed an event of note. The marriage was a success in the sense that no open objections had been raised. Indeed, some recognized that if war came again to the realm, a Stark who had the rumored blood of Valyria in his union might hold an unexpected advantage, at least in terms of mystique. Others grumbled privately that it was an unorthodox match, that House Stark should have wed into a known Westerosi family to secure more tangible alliances. But none said so openly, not with Ned Stark's quiet but undeniable authority looming. Even as the last of the guests departed, Valyna's retinue remained, settling into a corner of Winterfell's keep. They busied themselves with tasks that seemed oddly ceremonial, burning incense in daily rituals, polishing heirlooms that bore a faint, scaly design. They treated Valyna with deference still, but now she was Lady Stark, and her voice carried more weight than before. When she asked them to cease a certain incense that was too pungent for Winterfell's halls, they complied without complaint. Robb observed these interactions from a distance, impressed by how naturally she commanded their respect while still showing humility. Weeks passed, and the newlywed couple began to settle into a routine. They shared breakfasts in the solar, discussing the day's plans. Robb took Valyna riding through the Wolf's Wood, showing her the tracks of various animals, demonstrating how direwolves hunted in packs. She listened intently, sometimes asking questions that betrayed her fascination with the savage beauty of the North. In the evenings, they dined with Ned, Catelyn, and the rest of the family, discussing matters of the realm. There were times, especially late at night, when they found themselves alone and their conversations turned more personal, about their fears, their hopes, their role in shaping the future. Each found comfort in the fact that neither claimed to know all the answers. Yet beneath these domestic routines, the realm's tensions festered. Ravens from King's Landing spoke of mounting disputes between the crown and the Lannisters, of King Robert's failing health, of rumors that the Iron Islands were stirring with renewed ambition. None of this was confirmed, but the letters implied that trouble brewed. Ned shared these letters with Robb, though he did not burden Valyna with every detail. The times were uneasy, and one misstep could draw the North into conflict. Still, life at Winterfell trudged on, grounded by the land's raw resilience. One cold afternoon, as snow battered the castle, Valyna made her way to the library tower. She had grown fond of the old place, with its dusty shelves and tomes chronicling generations of Starks. She found Robb there, flipping through a set of parchments dealing with the genealogies of various houses. He looked up when she entered, smiling warmly, an expression she had come to cherish. She asked him what he was studying, and he showed her a section detailing the Targaryen bloodlines. Valyna scanned the pages, seeing how they documented every branch of that once great house. There was no mention of her Cordine line. If indeed her family had branched off centuries before, it was lost in the swirl of the doom and the chaos that followed. She traced her finger across the lines, lingering on the names of kings and queens who once rode dragons into battle. "Do you wish to know more about your own lineage?" Robb asked softly. She hesitated, glancing at him. "Yes and no. Part of me hopes it's all real. Part of me fears what that might mean, what expectations it carries. I don't know if I want to be the standard-bearer for an entire lost heritage. I only want to be myself. A woman who can stand at your side, who can help guide the North, who can honor the memories of those who came before me without being crushed by them." Robb took her hand in his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "Whatever your heritage, you're my wife first. I don't need a dragon queen. I need a partner, someone I can trust. If that heritage becomes a tool that helps us protect the North, then that's well and good. If it becomes a burden, then we'll face it together." She exhaled, a small smile curving her lips. The swirling uncertainty within her settled a bit. They stood like that for a moment, the quiet hush of the library wrapping around them. Outside, the wind howled. In the weeks that followed, that storm of rumor and tension swirling throughout Westeros grew darker. News trickled in that King Robert had died unexpectedly after a hunting mishap, and that the Lannisters were tightening their grip on the throne. Lord Tywin stood his hand, Joffrey Baratheon was crowned, and stories of intrigue and betrayal filtered northward. Ned Stark, as was his nature, remained vigilant. He wrote letters, read the replies, and grew increasingly troubled. The new king was a boy rumored to have little patience for the old ways, and the new regent might look upon the North as a place to be contained rather than respected. Such concerns bled into the life of Robb and Valyna, even if their immediate day-to-day remained tranquil. Robb's training intensified, as if preparing for the possibility of war. Valyna sat in on councils, learning about the bannermen's dispositions and the resources available. She offered insights into trade routes across the narrow sea, hinting that the North might secure new allies if the Southern Crown turned hostile. Ned listened, mulling each suggestion, though his guarded expression never revealed how he truly felt. Catelyn advised patience. War was not yet declared, but the realm had a habit of stumbling into bloodshed when power shifted so abruptly. Then came the moment that changed everything. A raven arrived bearing the Lannister lion, summoning Lord Eddard Stark to King's Landing to swear fealty to King Joffrey, reaffirming the North's loyalty. It was an expected move, for every great lord was demanded to pay homage. But the tone of the letter was more of a command than a courtesy, laced with veiled implications that the new regime would not tolerate disobedience. Ned stared at the parchment, a coldness settling in his eyes. He was Warden of the North by the old king's decree, and he had always served with honor. Now, it seemed, the throne's occupant was barely more than a child, guided by those who thrived on ambition. In the corner of the solar, Valyna and Robb waited, breath halted as Ned made his choice. He looked at them both, lines of worry etched into his face. If I go, the North is left vulnerable to the Lannisters' manipulations. If I refuse, it could be seen as rebellion. Perhaps it's time we consider forging alliances beyond these shores, or showing that the North will stand for itself. Robb felt his heartbeat pound. He exchanged a look with Valyna, recalling all the quiet conversations they'd had about her father's rumored connections and the possibility of appealing to certain free cities. Could that truly be an option now? The image of a North defying the crown loomed, carrying the possibility of open war. He straightened, stepping forward. We won't be alone. If we call our bannermen, they'll come. And we have House Cordine. Father, you've always counseled caution, but the Lannisters' reputation is not honorable. Ned nodded gravely. His gaze flicked to Valyna. Do you believe your father would support us if we found ourselves in conflict with the Iron Throne? She paused, measuring her words. My father is an old man. He desires peace, but he also knows that if the Lannisters gain too much power, it could stifle trade and endanger our interests. We do have friends in a few of the free cities, Bravos particularly, who respect the memory of old Valyria's scattered bloodlines. We can approach them discreetly. Ned folded the letter, his thoughts turning. We may need that. For now, I must respond in a way that preserves our honor while safeguarding our people. I will write to King's Landing, acknowledging the new king, but I will not rush south. The weather is turning, and there are matters to settle in the north. He sighed. We walk a tightrope here. Let us hope we do not slip. Thus, the seeds of conflict were sown, and Robb realized that the quiet contentment he and Valyna had found in their marriage might soon be threatened by the storms of war. He felt a swirl of apprehension for his family, his home, and for Valyna, who had barely begun to find her place in the north. She stood beside him, though her chin raised, determination sparking in her eyes. Whatever came, they would face it together. And so the realm lurched toward another reckoning, with winter bearing down on them from one side and the Iron Throne's demands looming from the other. Within the halls of Winterfell, the dire wolf of House Stark had found its unlikely mate in a woman of rumored dragon's blood, forging a bond of ice and embers. Only time would tell what potency that union truly held, and what fires or frosts it might unleash across the Seven Kingdoms. The days that followed were filled with a hushed tension in every corridor of Winterfell. Huddled discussions replaced the echoes of routine chatter. Servants who once moved with the confidence of long habit now cast wary glances over their shoulders, as if sensing an invisible threat creeping past the gates. The sky itself seemed perpetually gray, promising deeper snows and a cold that gnawed at the spirit as well as the flesh. Lord Eddard Stark, solemn as ever, weighed King Joffrey's summons in the privacy of the solar. Though he continued about his duties, reviewing the storerooms, speaking with bannermen, ensuring the security of the keep, an undercurrent of resolve guided his every step. He would not race to King's Landing like a supplicant, but neither would he openly declare rebellion. Not yet. Robb sensed his father's turmoil and mirrored it in his own way. The young man spent long hours with Maester Luwin, dissecting every snippet of news from the south, every rumor of unrest. Valyna joined them more often than not. At first, she kept her silence, absorbing the intricacies of Westerosi politics, but soon her own observations began to shape their plans. She volunteered the possibility of sending discreet messages to her father, Lord Cordine, who had connections in Pentos and Bravos, connections that might prove invaluable if trade routes were closed or if the Lannisters attempted to blockade the north. Though Robb had never imagined House Stark needing such distant alliances, the more he listened to Valyna, the more he recognized her resourcefulness. She was no mere ornament, and in the face of impending crisis, she displayed a spark of boldness that surprised him. I propose we send a man we trust to meet with Bravosi contacts, she said one afternoon in the library tower. Her voice kept deliberately low as the wind rattled the shutters. Someone who can discuss the potential for open trade or perhaps even loans if war breaks out. Gold often wins battles long before swords are drawn. Robb looked thoughtful. My father may not relish the idea of debts to foreign bankers, he admitted. He'd prefer the North stand on its own, but we'll speak to him. Winterfell has never courted such alliances before, at least not that I recall. Valina's pale violet eyes flicked over an open tome detailing shipping routes from White Harbor to Essos. Even so, these are different times. The Lannisters have the gold of Casterly Rock behind them. Should they force your father's hand, we'll need every advantage we can muster. Robb exhaled. He saw the logic of it, even as it chafed against the North's long-standing independence. We'll show him the plans, quietly. I just hope we won't have to rely on such measures. She reached out and briefly touched his hand. I hope so too. That same evening, Ned convened a small gathering of trusted advisors in one of Winterfell's lesser-known chambers. A cramped room with narrow windows and a thick oaken table. Within these walls, generations of Starks had planned hunts, negotiated treaties, and strategized during times of crisis. Now, Ned sat at the table's head, looking more grim than usual. Robb and Valina sat on one side. Catelyn joined them. Maester Luwin perched at the far end, hands folded atop old scrolls containing genealogical data, supply tallies, and bits of Raven correspondence. Ser Roderick Castle stood to the side, arms crossed over his chest, mustache bristling at the tension that hung in the air. Ned began by recounting all the letters from King's Landing. King Joffrey's coronation was swift and overshadowed by the growing influence of the Lannisters, he said, a hint of distaste sharpening his tone. Some whisper that Queen Cersei, rather than her son, truly holds the reins of power. Tywin Lannister, as Hand, demands fealty from all corners of the realm. They want me to come south, stand before the Boy King, and reaffirm the North's loyalty. Catelyn's mouth tightened. We know what happened to Jon Arryn when he questioned too closely, she said, referencing the late Hand's sudden death. I don't trust King's Landing to treat you with any fairness, especially under Queen Cersei's watchful eye. Robb clenched his fists. So do we send a refusal? That would be openly seditious, Ned said, and it would grant the Lannisters a pretext for marching north. You know as well as I that many a war was begun over lesser slights. The truth is, Joffrey can claim the throne by lineage, however suspect it might be, and if the North refuses him outright, we risk being labeled traitors. Valina's voice was quiet yet firm. Might we delay your departure, my lord? Citing winter weather, the need to prepare your lands for the cold season, and perhaps also to gather certain evidence regarding the legitimacy of this new king? If rumors of the boy's parentage are to be believed, the Lannisters may have more to fear from us than we from them. Ned shot her a careful look. He was not one to trust rumors easily, even those that had cropped up in King Robert's final days. Yet the suggestion that Joffrey might not be a Baratheon at all still lingered in the recesses of Ned's mind, a suspicion that had once cost him dearly in an alternate telling of events. I will not start a war based on half-truths, Ned murmured. Still, it's wise to gather information. If we can confirm anything about the boy's parentage, it might change the entire shape of the realm. There's also the question of House Cordane's role, said Ser Roderick gruffly. Begging your pardon, my lord, but many a northerner wonders what advantage your son's new marriage will bring. If the Lannisters march, will House Cordine send arms? Or is it only gold they might offer? Soldiers are what we'll need if it comes to that. Valina lifted her chin. My father's bannermen are modest in number compared to a great Westerosi house, but our contacts across the narrow sea could provide sellswords, if it came to that. Also, I'd argue that forging alliances beyond the crown's reach could prove vital if the realm falls into civil strife. Ned listened with the pensive calm of a man who had considered these possibilities from every angle. We'll proceed carefully, he said at last. I shall write to the crown, expressing regret that winter preparations prevent me from traveling immediately. I will promise to journey south once we've secured the harvest and made certain the roads are passable for a lord's retinue. That should buy us time. Catelyn nodded, relief warring with concern on her face. And in that time we can see which way the winds blow. If the rumors of discontent in the Riverlands prove true, or if the Lannisters make a move against our allies, we'll know soon enough. Then it's settled, Ned said. We'll watch, we'll wait, and we'll prepare. In the days that followed, Winterfell braced itself for that waiting game. Scouts were sent down the King's Road, tasked with reporting any unusual movement of troops. Ravens flew to the major northern lords, relaying Ned's summons for discretion and readiness. Many in the north had no desire to bend the knee to a boy king guided by Lannister gold. Yet they also had no appetite for a war that might bring the kingdom's wrath upon them. Still, the Stark name carried weight, and if the time came to call the banners, most houses would respond. Even the Boltons, albeit with their usual cold politeness, sent back a measured reply that they would comply with Winterfell's requests, though Ned, ever cautious, kept a wary eye on that line, for House Bolton was known for ambitions of its own. Valyna, newly a Stark by marriage, found herself confronted with the North's deep skepticism. She walked the halls in her fur-lined cloak, feeling the gazes upon her. Most of the small folk regarded her with quiet curiosity. She had been polite, even gentle, in her dealings with them, but she was still an outsider. Some whispered that she carried dragon's eyes. A few feared she might bring ill omens upon the North. Others, especially older members of the household staff, regarded her with a certain awed respect, recalling half-remembered stories of Targaryen might. One morning, she decided to visit the kitchens, offering to learn some of the local recipes. If she was to be Lady of Winterfell when Robb eventually ascended, she wanted to understand the daily life of the castle. The head cook, a stout woman named Gerda, eyed her with a mixture of deference and wariness as she entered. Pots boiled, ovens radiated heat, and scullions dashed about, chopping vegetables or kneading dough. "My lady," Gerda said, wiping her hands on her apron, "you honor us with your presence. Is there something I can do for you?" Valyna smiled softly, brushing a strand of silver-gold hair behind her ear. "I only wish to see what wonders you create down here. The roasts, the pies, the stews. I find them heartier and richer than anything I tasted across the sea. Perhaps you might show me a thing or two. I'd like to learn, if you don't mind." The cook's brow furrowed in surprise. Highborn ladies seldom ventured into the kitchens unless it was to complain about a dish. But there was a genuine curiosity in Valyna's gaze that seemed to disarm her. "As you wish, my lady. We're just now preparing a stew for tonight's supper, venison with barley and onions. You can watch, though we've not much time for polite chatter." "I wouldn't expect you to slow down on my account," Valyna said, stepping around a young scullion who scurried by with a bowl of chopped leeks. She felt the heat of the ovens at her back, smelled the tang of roasting meats and fresh bread. Over the next hour, she observed Gerda's methods, occasionally asking a question about spices or cooking times. Now and then, she offered her own suggestions, mentioning a spice from Essos that might warm the palate, describing how certain peppers were used in bravos to ward off the chill. Gerda listened, her skepticism slowly giving way to cautious intrigue. By the time Valyna left, the entire kitchen seemed a shade friendlier. That evening, when bowls of venison stew were ladled out to the lords, ladies, and knights at Winterfell, several remarked on a subtle new flavor. It was faint, just a whisper of something beyond the typical northern seasonings, but it lent warmth to each spoonful. Robb tasted it and shot Valyna a curious look across the high table. She gave him a small smile, pleased that her little experiment might help bridge some gap between her and her new home. Despite such small triumphs, the uncertain days ground on. Ravens came and went, bearing tidings that seldom brought comfort. One letter arrived from the Eyrie, where Lisa Arryn held her son as Lord of the Vale in isolation. Another arrived from Riverrun, where Lord Hoster Tully was reported to be in failing health, leaving much of the running of the castle to Catelyn's brother Edmure. Rumors of skirmishes in the Riverlands filtered north, raising Ned's concern that the Lannisters might be testing the waters by raiding Tully lands. Yet no direct threat was made against the north, giving Ned no firm pretext to call his banners for war. It was a chilly dawn when the next significant development arrived. Robb was in the courtyard, sparring with a few of his father's guards, the clash of steel echoing off the stone walls. Valyna had joined him to watch, standing cloaked by the wall. She noted that while Robb was not yet as tall as some of the guards, His swordsmanship had gained polish in recent months. His strokes were strong, efficient, lacking the flourishes that southern knights might favor. The young man had the makings of a formidable warrior and, in time, perhaps a remarkable leader. Suddenly, a commotion by the gate drew everyone's attention. A handful of mounted riders appeared, snow caked on their cloaks, their horses lathered with sweat. They bore no banners, but at the head rode a man in the black of the Night's Watch. He dismounted heavily, nearly collapsing from exhaustion, and called out for Lord Stark. Robb handed his training sword to a guard and hurried forward, Vina close behind. They found Maester Luwin already bustling toward the stranger, with Ned emerging from one of the corridors. "Lord Stark," the Black Brother gasped, dropping to one knee. "I bring word from the wall. Dire tidings, there are sightings beyond the wall. Wildlings gathering in numbers not seen in ages. And rumors of darker things, dead men walking." He paused, swallowing hard. "Lord Commander Mormont sends urgent requests for more men, more supplies. He fears the worst with winter closing in." A hush fell over the courtyard. The watchers exchanged anxious glances. The old tales of the long night of the White Walkers were legends that most in Westeros dismissed. Yet, if the Night's Watch was truly alarmed, it could not be taken lightly. Ned bent down to help the man stand. "You've ridden hard and long," he said gently, though his face was grave. "We'll see you cared for. Maester Luwin, have this man fed and given rest. Then I'll speak with him in detail about what he's seen." The watchman nodded gratefully, his teeth chattering. "Aye, my lord. Thank you." As the Black Brother and the other riders were guided away to the warmth of the barracks, Ned turned to Robb and Vina, his eyes shadowed by mounting worries. "The last thing we need is trouble beyond the wall, when the south seems equally perilous. Still, we cannot ignore this." Robb took a slow breath. "If the Night's Watch is facing danger, we must do what we can. They protect our kingdom from what lies in the far north, whether it's wildlings or worse." Ned nodded. "The North's first duty is to the living who dwell under its protection, and that includes supporting the Watch." He gave Robb a long, measured look. "You should join me when I speak to their messenger. It will be good training in how to balance the threats both near and far." Vina touched Robb's forearm lightly. "We're living in uncertain times. Your father's right. Gather all the knowledge you can. Perhaps the realm's troubles in the south will pale if something truly grave comes from beyond the wall." Robb clasped her hand briefly, a small gesture of gratitude. Then he followed his father, chest tightening with the realization that he was being drawn into problems that spanned the entire length of the kingdom. Word soon spread throughout Winterfell that the Night's Watch had delivered grave warnings. Whispers of white shadows and unearthly creatures circulated among the small folk, though few truly believed such tales. To many, the threat of wildling incursions seemed more tangible than the notion of the undead. Nevertheless, it increased the overall sense of foreboding that had taken root in the castle. That evening, Ned conducted a formal meeting in the Great Hall, inviting key members of his household and a handful of local lords who happened to be visiting Winterfell. The Black Brother, newly bathed and fed, stood at attention by the dais, flanked by two of his companions. Though clearly exhausted, he spoke with clarity about the wildling gatherings, the rumored leadership of one calling himself the King Beyond the Wall, and the stories drifting down from craggy villages along the Frostfangs. His voice dropped when he mentioned the dead rising, but he offered no concrete proof, only the shaky testimony of a few terrified men who swore they had seen corpses moving in the night. Ned pressed him for details, but the messenger had little more to give. The region beyond the wall was vast, and the watch was stretched thin. All the man could offer was the Lord Commander's plea for aid and additional forces. Sighing, Ned looked to the assembly. "I've always recognized the importance of the Night's Watch," he said quietly. "I served there briefly in my youth, and I know Mormont to be a man not given to flights of fancy. If he asks for help, then the threat is real, whether it be wildlings or something worse." One of the visiting lords, a grizzled bannerman named Lord Stout, rose from his seat. "But my lord, with King Robert dead and the boy on the throne, we may have trouble enough in the south. Can we afford to send men to the wall if we might need them against Lannister treachery? Murmurs of agreement rippled across the hall. Ned's expression hardened. We are not children squabbling over sweetmeats. Our duty is to the realm, and the realm includes the far north. The Lannisters pose a political threat, but if there's an invasion of wildlings, or worse, pouring south of the wall, all our petty disputes will mean nothing. If the Night's Watch falls, the north becomes the first battlefield. We cannot let that happen. The hall fell silent. Even the crackle of torches seemed muted. Finally, Lord Stout bowed his head. You speak truth, Lord Stark. I will pledge some men, so long as you can confirm that their families and holdings will be safe should the South turn hostile. Catelyn, standing behind Ned, spoke up. Their safety is Winterfell's concern, she said calmly. We will protect our people to the best of our ability. With that pledge, more lords acquiesced. Though the contributions would not be vast, they would be enough to send a detachment of spearmen and archers northward, along with supplies of food and warm clothing. The messenger from the Watch expressed deep gratitude, relief etched in his tired features. Later, in the privacy of their chamber, Robb and Valyna reflected on what had transpired. She sat by the hearth, unbraiding her long hair, letting it fall across her shoulders. Robb stood behind her, slowly working through the tangles with gentle fingers. The flames danced in the fireplace, casting shadows that flickered over the stone walls. It feels as though we're being torn in two directions, Robb said, his voice low. Southward lies King's Landing, a young king, and potential war with the Lannisters. Northward, the wall calls for help against threats we barely understand. Valyna closed her eyes, leaning her head back slightly, finding comfort in his touch. In Valyria's ancient days, my ancestors supposedly juggled many perils. Rival dragon lords, expanding territory, the threat of the doom that finally swallowed them all. Sometimes they acted swiftly, other times they let rivalries fester. It's said that arrogance led to their downfall. Perhaps humility is our best guide here. Robb listened, thinking about how her words echoed something his father might say. Then we must remain humble but watchful. You've been reading up on our histories, talking to the Maester. Do you think House Cordain's rumored heritage, your dragon's blood, holds any real power for us if the realm descends into chaos? She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes remained shut, and in the dancing glow of the fire, her face seemed tense with conflicting thoughts. Sometimes, when I was young, I believed that if I concentrated enough, I could feel the heat of the 14 flames coursing through me, she admitted softly, almost shy. But I've never seen proof that I can do anything extraordinary. My father taught me that our lineage is precious, but so are alliances, knowledge, and cunning. Those are the real powers we have in the world. He bent down, pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. I'd argue you're extraordinary in other ways, but you're right, there may be no literal dragonfire left in your veins. Still, your counsel has already proven invaluable to us. Don't discount that. She reached up, taking his hand and holding it against her cheek. A small flicker of affection passed between them, a reminder that even in the midst of looming threats, they had found some measure of closeness. We'll face what comes, she murmured. In the following weeks, Ned made good on his promise to support the Watch. A contingent of 100 men, composed of loyal bannermen and volunteers, was mustered at Winterfell's gates. They carried wagons loaded with food, furs, and weapons, an offering meant to strengthen the beleaguered outposts along the wall. Among the men were those who had once scoffed at the Night's Watch as a penal colony for criminals, but Ned's gravity and sense of duty had influenced them enough to stand forward. The Black brothers who had come to Winterfell joined them, eager to guide the force northward along the King's Road. Robb stood in the courtyard on the day of their departure, watching as the final wagons rolled out beneath the portcullis. The wind tugged at the banners on the ramparts, direwolf insignias fluttering starkly against the gray sky. He knew the North's resources were finite, especially with winter's deeper cold descending, yet sending help felt right. It was what the Starks had always done. Defend the realm even when it cost them. Valyna approached, drawing her cloak tight, a dusting of snow on her shoulders. She watched the procession, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Do you think this will be enough?" He exhaled a plume of mist. "I hope so. If half the stories are true, we'll need more than men and steel. But it's a start." She gazed after the wagons a while longer, then turned toward him. "I spoke with Maester Luwin earlier. He mentioned that Lord Tywin has sent another missive demanding your father's swift presence in King's Landing." Robb's jaw tightened. "I suspected as much. They grow impatient. Maybe they worry the North is preparing to resist them." "Are we?" she asked, searching his face. "Or do you think your father will yield, try to keep the peace?" Robb considered that. "My father won't bend the knee to a tyrant, but he also won't rush to call his banners unless he has no other choice. The North is not eager for a civil war, especially with winter coming. But if the Lannisters push too hard..." He let the thought trail off. Valyna nodded, understanding the unspoken words. Perhaps the Lannisters had not realized how much the Starks would dig in their heels when threatened. Or perhaps they did, and hoped to crush them swiftly before they could gather strength. Another fortnight passed, each day bringing a swirl of minor events that nonetheless contributed to the sense of building pressure. Riders from White Harbor arrived, bearing news that Lord Wyman Manderly seemed open to the idea of forging new trading pacts with Bravos, provided it wouldn't anger the Iron Throne. The Karstarks sent word that they were reinforcing their holdings, just in case. The Umbers from Last Hearth declared themselves ever ready for a fight, though whether that fight would be with wildlings or with the Lannisters remained uncertain. And through it all, the talk of the King beyond the Wall and strange sightings north of the Wall continued to filter south. One morning, Ned asked Robb and Valyna to join him in the solar for a private discussion. Catelyn was already there, standing by the window with her arms folded. Snow cascaded past the glass, painting the outside world in white. Ned, seated at a small table, looked up with an air of resignation as they entered. "It seems the time has come," Ned said, tapping a scroll bearing the Lannister lion. "They insist I present myself at court within the month. They offer veiled threats, talk of seizing trade with the North, denying us shipments of grain or metal if I do not comply. As much as I loathe the idea of leaving Winterfell, I cannot ignore this without consequence." Catelyn spoke up, her voice tight with concern. "You can't travel alone. We should send a proper retinue to ensure your safety. The Lannisters might view a large group as a challenge, but anything less could invite an ambush." Ned's face was stony with worry. "I'll take guards from loyal houses, but I refuse to empty Winterfell of defenders. If the worst happens and I'm seized in King's Landing, I need the North prepared to act. Robb, you will remain here as my heir. You will oversee the day-to-day running of Winterfell with your mother's help. I trust you both to carry on if anything should befall me." Robb's heart pounded. He glanced at Valyna, who looked equally concerned. "Father, it's too dangerous. The moment you set foot in King's Landing..." "I know," Ned interrupted softly, "but the realm demands it. If I do not go, it will be deemed open rebellion. At the very least, I must attempt to preserve peace. If war is truly inevitable, let it be the Lannisters who bear the stain of aggression, not the Starks." Valyna chose her words carefully. "My lord, if there is any counsel you wish passed on to my father, or if you want me to coordinate any measures with the free cities while you're away, I stand ready." A faint smile touched Ned's lips. "Your father's goodwill may prove essential, my lady. Write to him. Let him know the difficulties we face. If House Cordine and its overseas connections can provide supplies or at least a safe route for commerce, it may shield the North from Lannister pressure. But keep it discreet. We do not want to broadcast to the throne that we seek foreign assistance." She bowed her head in acknowledgement. "I'll see to it at once." Catelyn stepped away from the window. "We must also handle the question of who accompanies you. We can't let you ride into the lion's den unprotected. Ser Roderick, or perhaps a few trusted knights from House Castle, House Pool." Ned nodded, lifting the scroll again. "I'll choose a modest escort, enough to show we do not fear them, but not so large as to provoke immediate hostility. Let us make those preparations. I plan to depart within a week, weather permitting. That week passed in a flurry of organization. Tailors readied clothing suitable for King's Landing's warmer climate. Guards were selected, provisions gathered. Letters were dispatched to bannermen, informing them of Ned's journey and instructing them to remain vigilant. Valyna penned careful messages to her father, Lord Cordine, outlining the precarious position of the North and seeking any assistance or counsel he could provide. She read the letters to Robb before sending them, ensuring that each phrase walked the fine line between honesty and caution. Meanwhile, Ned and Catelyn spent hours sequestered together, discussing every possibility, from forging alliances in the capital to the dire scenario that Ned might end up imprisoned. When the morning of Ned's departure finally arrived, Winterfell's courtyard brimmed with a subdued crowd. Stable boys held the horses, their breath rising in white plumes. Guards stood at attention, cloaked in furs. Robb, wearing the stark gray of House Stark, stood at the center of it all, next to his father. The older man looked up at the sky, noticing a thin break in the clouds where the sun attempted to peek through. An omen, perhaps, Ned murmured. May the gods see us safely to King's Landing. Robb forced a brave smile. We'll await your return, father. And if anything goes awry, I know, Ned said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. You'll do what must be done. He turned to Valyna, who stood slightly behind Robb. Watch over him, my lady. He has a good heart, but the world is a treacherous place. She inclined her head. You have my word, my lord. Catelyn, wrapped in a heavy cloak, embraced Ned. A hush fell over the courtyard, every onlooker aware that these farewells could be final. Ned gently touched Catelyn's cheek. Then, with a nod to Ser Roderick and the men chosen to accompany him, he mounted his horse. The gates swung open, letting the soft light of the winter sun spill in. The column of riders moved forward, hooves clopping on the cold earth. Ned Stark did not look back as he passed beneath the portcullis, but Robb imagined he could feel his father's resolve like an echo reverberating through the castle walls. In the wake of Ned's departure, Winterfell seemed somehow larger and emptier. Robb felt the weight of responsibility settle on him like an iron mantle. Each morning, he convened with Maester Luwin and Catelyn, receiving updates on everything from food stores to letters that arrived bearing news from the south. He also oversaw training drills for the guards, ensuring that the men remained sharp. Valyna assisted him in matters of administration, her methodical approach a welcome balance to his more direct, sometimes impulsive style. More than once he felt relief that he was beside him. She had a knack for quiet diplomacy that he sometimes lacked. One chilly afternoon, they took a walk beyond the castle walls to inspect some outlying farms. Robb wanted to ensure the small folk had enough provisions to last the winter. They rode together on horseback accompanied by a small guard. Snow crunched under hooves, and the cold wind whipped at their cloaks. As they passed one small hamlet, the farmers emerged hesitantly from their huts, bowing their heads to their lord's heir and his lady. Robb dismounted, speaking to them about their harvest, the condition of their livestock. Valyna asked questions as well, her tone gentle, her face filled with genuine concern. Gradually, the farmers relaxed, grateful for the attention. When the pair rode away, leaving a promise of additional grain if needed, Robb felt a stirring of pride that they had brought comfort to those who lived under Stark protection. On their way back, as the sun began to dip, Robb noticed the sky reddening in the west. The color bled across the clouds like a wound. He pulled his horse up beside Valyna's, letting the guards ride a bit ahead so they could speak in relative privacy. You've taken to the north well, he remarked, glancing at her. I see how the people look at you now. Less suspicion, more warmth. Maybe your new stew spice helped. She laughed softly. I'd like to think kindness works more wonders than exotic spices. A gust of wind tugged at her hair, sending silver strands across her face. She brushed them aside. Though I do wish it wasn't under such dire circumstances. With your father gone, all of this worry hangs in the air. Robb's expression turned pensive. I can't shake the feeling that something terrible might happen in King's Landing. My father is too honorable for their games. The Lannisters, they've never been known for mercy. She nodded. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the horses plodding through the snow. Dusk settled like a hush over the land, the shapes of trees stark against the sky. Then Valyna shifted in her saddle. We must be prepared for all possibilities. If Ned Stark is taken prisoner or worse, the North will be called to action. I'm no prophet, but I sense the realm is on the brink of upheaval. His jaw tightened. If that day comes, I'll not hesitate to call the banners. She reached out, laying a hand on his forearm. I'll stand with you. They continued back toward Winterfell, the flicker of torches visible on the distant walls. There, in the lengthening shadows, Robb realized that for all the anxiety that gripped him, he found a measure of strength in Valyna's presence. She had brought something of old Valyria's fortitude, tempered by the stark sense of duty. It was a combination he found quietly inspiring. Days melted into weeks. Winter deepened its grip, snowfall accumulating in drifts around the castle, the nights impossibly long. Ravens arrived sporadically from King's Landing, bearing cryptic messages about court intrigues, feasts, alliances, decrees. Ned's own letters were careful, revealing little. He wrote only that he was treated with courtesy by the king and his council, that he strove to protect the North's interests, that tensions in the capital remained high. Robb wanted to read between the lines, to parse whether his father was truly safe or merely biding his time. But nothing in the letters offered clarity. If anything, they hinted that Ned was treading a delicate line, one misstep away from disaster. Valyna, seeing how the uncertainty gnawed at Robb, suggested they find a distraction. Too many hours spent pondering worst-case scenarios will eat you alive, she said quietly one afternoon, when Robb paced the solar like a caged wolf. Come with me to the library. We've discovered old maps that show trade routes to the Free Cities. Maps we can use to chart potential supply lines if the South tries to cut us off. Reluctantly, he agreed. They ascended the twisting steps to the library tower, stepping into the dry hush of parchment and leather tomes. Maester Luwin had compiled a section of shelves dedicated to Essos, including some volumes that dated back to the days just after Aegon's conquest. Valyna led Robb through them, pulling out a wide scroll that displayed the narrow sea in surprisingly accurate detail. Painted lines indicated shipping lanes from Dragonstone and Duskendale to Myr, Pentos, Bravos, and beyond. If House Cordine can negotiate preferential shipping for us, Valyna said, smoothing out the parchment on a reading table, then even if the Iron Throne tries to blockade the southern ports, we could funnel goods through the eastern route. White Harbor would be our gateway. Robb studied the map, running his hand over the graceful lines. It's not something the North has done often, but these are different times. She glanced at him, seeing the worry etched into his features. Sometimes we adapt or perish, she said gently. My father always taught me that much of survival lies in the will to change. He nodded, tracing the route from White Harbor to Bravos with the tip of his finger. The idea of forging alliances outside of Westeros still felt foreign to him. Yet the presence of a Cordine bride at Winterfell was already a symbol of bridging old gaps. If it comes to war, the North will need more than swords, he admitted. Supply lines, gold, ships. All these things the Lannisters have in abundance. We have the loyalty of our bannermen, yes, but times are changing. We can't be naive about the scale of conflict we might face. She placed her hand atop his, stilling his restless movement. We'll do what we must, for your family, for the North. For a moment, they looked at each other in the quiet library, the fire in the hearth casting a warm glow. Robb felt a subtle pulse of gratitude that she was here, not just as a political ally but as a partner who grasped the gravity of their situation. Without words, he intertwined his fingers with hers. The hush of the library held them in a brief pocket of calm, a respite from the storms beyond. That calm shattered 2 days later with the arrival of a raven from King's Landing, its contents disturbing in the extreme. The message was brief, penned by an unidentified hand, and it spoke of Eddard Stark's imprisonment, charged with treason against the throne. The letter claimed that Lord Stark had conspired to overthrow King Joffrey, that he had schemed with Robert's brothers, Stannis and Renly Baratheon, to dispute Joffrey's legitimacy. It ended by warning the North to bend the knee or face the wrath of the Iron Throne. Robb read the message aloud in the solar while Catelyn, pale-faced, clung to the back of a chair. Valyna stood at his side, her breath caught in her throat. As he finished, a dreadful silence enveloped them. Catelyn's voice trembled. "He's done nothing wrong. It's the Lannisters, Cersei. They found cause to brand him a traitor. Seven, save us. What do we do?" Robb felt rage surge through him, hot and fierce. His father imprisoned, labeled a traitor for telling the truth about Joffrey's parentage. He had no doubt that was the root of it. Ned's honor was being used against him. For a moment, he clenched his fists so hard his knuckles turned white. Valyna placed a hand on his forearm, a mute gesture to steady him. He forced himself to breathe, to think. He turned to Catelyn. "We call the banners," he said hoarsely. "Father must be freed, and the Lannisters must not think they can hold him without consequence. If they want the North to bend the knee, they'll find us on our feet, swords drawn." Tears shone in Catelyn's eyes, but she nodded, some of her Tully resolve surfacing. "We cannot leave him to rot in their dungeons. I will gather what strength I can from the Riverlands, though it may be in chaos. You lead the North, Robb. Your father left you in command." Valyna felt her heart pounding, but she spoke with surprising clarity. "Then it begins. War. We must send ravens to every bannerman, muster our forces. And we should reach out to my father. I can ask him to dispatch any aid he can muster. Sells words, supplies, anything." Robb looked at her, the anger in his eyes tempered by gratitude. "Yes, do it. House Cordine has ties in Essos that might give us an edge. We'll need every advantage." Even as he said it, a wave of dread coursed through him. War was not a game. It would mean bloodshed on a scale the North had not seen in decades. But the alternative, to bow to the Lannisters, to let his father be executed for false charges, was unthinkable. He would not allow House Stark to be humiliated and destroyed. The moment demanded decisive action. Ravens took flight that very afternoon, each bearing a summons for the Northern Lords to rally at Winterfell. Warriors from Carhold, the Dreadfort, Bear Island, Last Hearth, and White Harbor would receive Ned's dire news, along with Robb's call to arms. The realm would soon learn that the wolves of the North were not docile lapdogs. Yet even as the letters flew, Catelyn made preparations to depart for Riverrun, hoping to secure Tully support and glean more information about her father's health and the Lannister activity in the Riverlands. Before she left, mother and son met in the Godswood, beneath the rust-red leaves of the Heart Tree. Snow dusted the branches, collecting in hollows of the carved face. Robb stood with his arms folded, shoulders tense, while Catelyn stood opposite him, the air between them as heavy as a drawn bowstring. "You are so young," she whispered, her voice cracking. "So young to bear the burden of leading an army, of carrying an entire house's fate. I wish." Robb stepped forward, embracing her. "I'll be all right, Mother. You taught me well. Father taught me well. And I have good advisors, Maester Luwin, Valyna, others. We won't flounder." She clung to him for a moment, as though memorizing the scent of his hair, the warmth of his cloak. "I know you won't flounder," she said into his chest, voice muffled. "But war is terrible, Robb. You've never seen it, none of us truly have, not in this generation. It isn't just glory and victory. It's fields of corpses, villages burned, families torn apart. If there is any way to save your father without sacrificing half the realm to bloodshed, you must take it." "I will," he promised, though he couldn't keep the tremor of fury from his voice. "But the Lannisters have shown they have no honor. They'll give no quarter unless forced. Better we march south with an army and meet them on our terms." Slowly, Catelyn pulled away, blinking back tears. "Then do what you must. I'll do my part to secure the Riverlands, and maybe the gods will guide us to a swifter end than we imagine." She pressed a final kiss to his cheek, lingering for a heartbeat, then turned and walked away, her cloak trailing on the snowy ground. Robb watched her go, feeling a hollow ache in his chest. When she disappeared, he stared at the heart tree's carved eyes for a long while, silently praying that the old gods would look kindly on them. That night, the entire castle buzzed with preparations for war. Smiths hammered out arrowheads and sharpened swords. Tailors rushed to sew new standards, the direwolf sigil stitched onto sturdy cloth. Stable hands readied horses and wagons for the journey south. In the great hall, tables were cleared to make space for hastily drawn maps. Robb, flanked by Maester Luwin and a few senior knights, plotted routes for the army, discussed potential rallying points, and took stock of provisions. Valyna drifted among them, quietly efficient. She wrote additional letters, instructing her father on which ports might prove most strategic for receiving shipments. She also spoke with the knights who would ride under the Stark banner, ensuring that each knew the gravity of the situation. Some were still uncertain about following a young man so recently come to manhood, but Valyna's calm confidence, paired with her status as Lady Stark, impressed upon them that the leadership in Winterfell was not to be trifled with. By the next dawn, the first contingents of northern bannermen began to arrive. A chill wind whipped the courtyard as riders bearing the sigils of Mormont, Serwyn, and Tallheart rode through the gates. Their faces were grim. They knew this was no mere border dispute, but a potential clash with the most powerful family in Westeros. Lady Meage Mormont, a fierce woman with no patience for southern fripperies, demanded to see Robb immediately upon arrival. She marched into the great hall, helm under her arm, armor crusted with road dust. "Lord Stark's boy, are you?" she said to Robb. Then, without waiting for a response, she continued, "We heard the news. Ned Stark in the Lannister cells. I'll see them flayed if they do him harm. My daughters said they'd march at once." Robb kept his tone respectful. "I'm glad to have the strength of Bear Island with us, Lady Mormont. We march as soon as we have enough men gathered." Meage Mormont eyed him critically. "You're young, but if you're anything like your father, you'll lead well. Just don't lose your nerve when the swords start swinging." He straightened, bristling with quiet pride. "I won't." Outside, the sound of horns announced more arrivals. Over the coming days, Winterfell transformed into a bustling mustering ground. Hundreds of men, then thousands, arrived on foot or horseback, carrying spears, axes, swords, and shields painted with the direwolf. Each group set up temporary camps outside the castle, braving the cold while awaiting orders. Fires burned in makeshift pits, tents sprang up like mushrooms after a rain, and the smell of horses, leather, and cooking oats mingled in the frozen air. Through it all, Robb struggled to hide his nervousness. He had never commanded such a force. He found himself relying heavily on Maester Luwin's counsel, on the experience of older knights. Yet he also brought a fresh perspective and a sense of fierce urgency. His father's life hung in the balance. "We cannot tarry," he told his advisors one evening. "Once the main host has assembled, we move south. We'll meet any Lannister host head-on if we must. Our goal is to free my father and ensure they never again think to threaten the north." The men around the table nodded, murmuring agreements, though some cast sidelong glances at the young wolf who sought to lead them into war. Valyna observed from the edge of the group, noting the subtle interplay of loyalties. She knew a few of these lords still doubted her presence, uncertain about this Valyrian bride who claimed ancient blood. Others seemed captivated by the aura she carried, half exotic, half practical. But if they questioned her, they kept it to themselves. The unifying force was Ned Stark's imprisonment. All could rally around that. Finally, the day came when Robb deemed they could wait no longer. Thousands of men now filled the fields around Winterfell, and more were still trickling in from distant corners of the north. But time was not on their side. Word from the south suggested the Lannisters were gathering armies of their own, and the longer they delayed, the more peril Ned might face. Standing atop the battlements at dawn, Robb gazed out at the sea of tents below. The wind numbed his cheeks, and he felt a swirl of emotions: excitement, dread, responsibility. Valyna stood beside him, equally somber. In the half-light, her silver-gold hair looked almost white, and her breath misted around her face. He exhaled slowly. "So it begins," he said. She nodded. "We'll return victorious. Or not at all." He glanced at her, saw the steely resolve in her violet eyes. Despite the grim situation, his heart found courage in that unwavering gaze. "We ride soon. Stay close by me in the vanguard? Or would you prefer a safer position in the baggage train?" The question was gently posed, but it carried genuine concern. Her lips twitched into a faint half-smile. "I'm no battle-hardened warrior, but I won't hide away while my husband leads an army. I'll ride with you. Besides, I can keep an eye on the supply lines and any negotiations we might need to conduct if we encounter allies or enemies on the road." He inclined his head, acceptance mingling with relief that she wasn't about to let fear dictate her choices. "Very well. Let's go meet our bannermen." They descended the steps, emerging into the courtyard where the highest lords had gathered for final instructions. The great John Umber, towering over most men, clasped Robb's arm in a crushing grip. Lord Rickard Karstark nodded respectfully, his lined face solemn. Roose Bolton stood quietly off to one side, expression unreadable, though he offered Robb a curt bow. Others formed a circle, waiting for the word. Robb raised his voice. "My lords, we march today. Our father, Lord Eddard Stark, is held a prisoner by the Lannisters, accused unjustly of treason. This cannot stand. We go south not to pillage or conquer, but to rescue our lord and to show the Iron Throne that the North will not be cowed. If they want war, we will give it to them, and the memory of our direwolf shall haunt them." A roar of approval rose from the throats of the gathered lords. Swords clanged against shields. The sound carried through the courtyard, echoing off ancient walls. Valyna felt a chill run down her spine. She stood behind Robb, watching him with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. The moment had come for him to prove himself not just a dutiful son but a leader of armies. Preparations concluded quickly. Horses were brought forth, wagons loaded, tents struck down, and banners raised high. Robb donned his armor. Sturdy plate over boiled leather, a cloak trimmed with wolf fur around his shoulders. Valyna wore lighter armor, a fitted leather cuirass dyed gray, though she also kept a thick cloak to ward off the cold. Her retinue, those Cordine men who had traveled with her from across the sea, likewise armed themselves with a blend of Essosi and Westerosi gear. It was a strange sight among the grim-faced northerners, but no one voiced any complaints. War made for strange bedfellows, after all. Finally, the gates of Winterfell opened wide, and the great host began its march. Thousands of feet trampled the snow, turning it to slush and mud. The thunder of hooves rumbled over the drawbridge. People lined the walls, some shouting encouragement, others weeping silently, as they watched husbands, fathers, and sons vanish beyond the horizon. Robb rode at the head, Theon Greyjoy to one side, Lord Umber to the other, his banner streaming in the wind. Valyna held her reins just behind him, scanning the shifting ranks with keen eyes. As they moved out, Robb stole a look back at Winterfell. The castle stood solid, ancient, the seat of House Stark for thousands of years. Would it remain safe, unbreached? Would they return victorious? Or would the North Seat become a relic of a bygone era, conquered by southern might? The thought struck him with a pang, but he forced it down, focusing on the road ahead. Days stretched into an endless rhythm of marching. Snow gave way to muddy roads as they traveled south, the temperature rising gradually. Men set up camp at night, cooking simple meals over fires, telling stories in hushed tones. Scouts rode ahead and behind, ensuring no ambush lurked in the swirling darkness. Ravens darted between the main host and outlying columns, carrying orders or updates. Now and then, lords argued over tactics, over foraging rights in certain territories, over whether a forced march might weaken the troops. Robb listened carefully, balancing the counsel of older, more experienced leaders with his own instincts. Vala, Aina spent her evenings poring over maps with the maesters and the experienced knights, ensuring the routes chosen would bring them swiftly toward the twins, held by Lord Walder Frey, and then further south to the Riverlands. With Catelyn presumably in Riverrun by now, they hoped to link forces. She also found time to write letters to her father, using coded language to describe the army's progress and potential supply needs. Whenever tensions flared among the Northmen, she did what she could to soothe them, offering a diplomatic word here, a suggestion of resourcefulness there. Some men listened. Others remained aloof, not entirely comfortable with a foreigner's counsel. Yet her perseverance chipped away at their resistance. One night, in a makeshift command tent, Robb stood over a map with the Greatjon, discussing the best approach to cross the Green Fork of the Trident. The air smelled of damp wool and horse sweat. Oil lanterns cast flickering light on the canvas walls. Valyna leaned over the map, noticing the line that marked the twins. "Those bridges belong to Walder Frey," Robb muttered. "He's notoriously prickly about letting armies cross without exacting a steep price. But we have no choice unless we want to attempt a dangerous ford upstream." Umber snorted. "That old weasel will probably demand betrothals for half his brood. We'll be lucky to cross at all." Robb's brow knitted. "I'm aware of his reputation. Still, we have to try negotiating. My mother might already be in Riverrun, or on her way to the twins herself. Let's hope she can smooth the path." Valyna tapped her finger on the map. "We might send an advance party with gifts or promises. The Freys will want assurances that their lands won't be ravaged by either side. If Walder Frey believes he stands to gain something substantial, he may relent." The Greatjon eyed her. "And what do we have to offer a man like him, aside from our swords at his throat if he refuses?" She met his gaze steadily. "We offer security and future alliances. We show we're not the Lannisters. We don't pay our debts with daggers in the dark." Umber gave a grunt, half laugh, half disdain, but Robb interjected. "She's right. We'll approach it diplomatically first. If that fails, well, we'll see." He looked around the tent. "We'll send riders tomorrow to parley with Lord Frey. The rest of us will keep marching. I want to reach the twins within the week." The Greatjon shrugged his massive shoulders. "Aye, just know that old Walder's not the sort to be easily charmed." At that, a small wry smile tugged at Robb's lips. "Let's just hope Mother's there already, or we'll have to rely on the chance he fears our numbers more than the Lannisters' gold." And so the Northmen pressed on, each day bringing them closer to the Riverlands, and to the heart of the storm. Rumors reached them of scattered skirmishes. One night, a disheveled group of refugees stumbled into camp, babbling about Lannister soldiers burning villages. Their terror only fueled the North's thirst for retribution. Robb had them fed and tended to, hearing their stories of men in lion-crested armor pillaging, raping, slaughtering. The young Stark's rage smoldered. Each tale of atrocity felt like a fresh brand searing his heart. Valyna watched him grapple with these emotions. On some nights, when the day's council was done, she would find him staring at the night sky, fists clenched, jaw tight. She'd approach quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder, and he would exhale a trembling breath. They'd speak in hushed tones, of the future, of Ned's plight, of the weight pressing on Robb's soul. Sometimes, words gave way to silence, and they stood side by side, letting the cold air clear their heads. At last, the day came when they spotted the twins in the distance. Two near-identical keeps, standing on either side of the Green Fork, linked by bridges over the wide river. A bleak drizzle fell from the sky, turning the ground to slick mud. Robb, at the head of the vanguard, raised a hand to call a halt. Horns were sounded, banners lowered. The army spread out in a rough encampment, forming neat rows of tents. Scouts were sent forward to parley. Morning light found Robb, Valyna, the Greatjon, and several other northern lords riding toward the gates of the eastern keep. Standard-bearers trotted behind them, direwolf flags snapping in the damp wind. The drawbridge was up, and from above, a group of Frey archers peered down with aloof interest. Robb hailed them, announcing himself as Robb Stark, son of Ned Stark, and demanded audience with Lord Walder Frey. After some delay, the gate creaked open, and a cluster of Frey men-at-arms emerged, pikes in hand. Their captain, a narrow-faced fellow, informed them that Lord Walder might consider meeting them but required assurances of safe conduct. The tone made it clear that they thought themselves gatekeepers to the only crossing that mattered. Robb swallowed his frustration. "We come under a banner of peace, requesting crossing and passage. We bring gifts and respect to Lord Walder. He'll find us willing to negotiate fairly." The captain squinted. "You'll wait here until we speak to the Lord. Don't try anything foolish." As the Frey soldiers withdrew, the Great John spat on the muddy ground. "They test our patience, boy. Give me a battering ram, and we'd smash our way through." Robb shook his head, ignoring the sting of the dismissive boy. "No. Bloodshed here would only delay us and cost us dearly. We can't lose men needlessly when our true battle lies further south." They waited under the drizzle, an uncomfortable stretch of time. At last, the portcullis lifted, and a small retinue of Freys emerged, including some younger members of the house and a gaunt septon. They indicated that Robb and his party could enter, but no more than 10 men-at-arms were permitted. Warily, Robb agreed, leaving the bulk of his force outside. He brought Vina, the Great John, and a handful of trusted knights. They dismounted and followed their Frey guides into the courtyard. Lord Walder Frey awaited them in the main hall. A withered man of many years, bundled in furs, flanked by a veritable brood of offspring, bastards, and assorted in-laws. The hall was not grand, but it was serviceable enough, with a long table where Walder sat in a high-backed chair. He gazed at Robb and his companions through rheumy eyes, lips pursed in a perpetual scowl. "So you're Ned Stark's pup," Walder said in a thin, rasping voice. "All grown now, are we? Come for my crossing, hm?" He beckoned with a bony finger, and a child, one of his granddaughters perhaps, helped him sip from a goblet of wine. Robb braced himself. "We seek passage, my lord. We're marching south to free my father, unjustly held by the Lannisters." "Unjustly, you say?" Walder sniffed. "I'll not stick my neck out for you if you can't offer something in return. Why should I offend the crown for a few wolfskins?" Vina spoke up, her voice clear. "Because the Lannisters have already offended the realm with their brutality, and they'll not spare the twins if it suits their purpose." Walder's eyes flicked to her, noting her silver-gold hair. "And who are you, girl?" "One of those Targaryen pretenders." She did not flinch. "I am Vina of House Cordine, my lord. Lady Stark, Robb's wife." "Ha! Another upstart foreign house," Walder grumbled. "Very well. You want my crossing, I want terms. Some might call them steep, but the Freys know their value. My heirs and wards must see benefit in this alliance, or I might just as easily keep my bridges raised and let you freeze out there." The negotiations that followed were excruciating. Walder Frey demanded marriages, wardships, positions of favor at Winterfell once Robb reclaimed the north. He insisted on a formal apology for perceived slights from House Stark in years past, some of which had likely never happened. Robb's temper flared more than once, but each time, he took a breath, remembering that their entire campaign hinged on crossing this river quickly. Finally, after hours of back and forth, a tentative deal was brokered. Some minor betrothals involving distant cousins, a promise to accept a few of Walder's brood as wards at Winterfell, and an oath that any spoils from a war with the Lannisters would include fair compensation to the twins. In return, Walder Frey agreed to open the bridges for the Stark host. As the old man concluded his demands, he shot a lecherous grin at Vina. "Pity I didn't ask for you as part of the arrangement," he cackled. "But I suppose you've already been taken by the pup." The Great John bristled at the insult, and Robb's glare promised violence. Yet Vina calmly met Walder's gaze, not dignifying the remark with a response. The air crackled with tension. At last, Walder waved a dismissive hand. "Go on, then. Cross. Just remember, if you fail, the Freys had no part in it." Robb forced a tight smile. "We won't forget your cooperation, my lord. The Freys will be rewarded when House Stark triumphs." Walder only made a wet sound in his throat, half laugh, half grunt. Off you go. Thus the crossing was won, if one could call it that. Robb and Valyna left the hall feeling both relief and revulsion, the great John cursing under his breath about spineless old weasels. Within hours, the Northmen were streaming across the bridges. The twins' gates stood open, guarded by watchful Freys as the columns of men, horses, and wagons clattered over the river. Robb rode at the forefront, rain spattering off his helm. He cast a final glance up at the battlements, where Walder Frey might be lurking, rubbing his hands together at the thought of new pledges from House Stark. Once safely on the southern bank, Robb ordered the host to make camp for the night. The river rushed behind them, a dark boundary they had finally crossed. Ahead lay the Riverlands, where House Tully held sway, if they could fend off the Lannisters. The war, it seemed, was truly beginning now. As twilight descended, Robb and Valyna found a moment of calm in their tent. The canvas rippled with every gust of wind, lantern light casting flickers across their faces. They removed their damp cloaks, sitting wearily on wooden stools near a small brazier. Tension seeped from their muscles, replaced by a hushed dread of what lay ahead. Robb leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes distant. He demanded half the realm in promises, he said. 7 save us. The gall of that man. Valyna offered a faint wry smile. At least we're across. That's what matters now. There's no turning back. He nodded, exhaling. No turning back. They sat there for a time, listening to the sounds of the camp, the neigh of horses, the clank of armor, the low murmur of men's voices. The sense of standing on the brink of something vast pressed upon them. The days ahead would be filled with battles, bargaining, and uncertain fate. They had come so far from the quiet halls of Winterfell, where a young bride with rumored Valyrian blood had stepped tentatively into a new life, and now both found themselves in the heart of a storm that might engulf the entire realm. Robb reached out and took Valyna's hand, squeezing gently. She met his gaze, giving him what reassurance she could. Though the road ahead was dark, they would walk it together. Perhaps that was all the comfort they could afford. They settled in for the night, each lost in thought. Sometime before sleep claimed them, Robb whispered, "We'll free Father, no matter what it takes." Valyna's voice was soft in the darkness. "We will, one way or another." Outside, the rain turned heavier, drumming on the tent, as if the very sky wept for what would come. The war of ice and lion had begun, and none could say who would stand victorious, or what cost would be exacted, when the final sword fell.